My name is Patricia Doyle. I'm 36 years old, and 3 days after my wedding, I thought I had finally stepped into a life that felt safe, stable, and far away from everything I had spent years trying to escape. We arrived at a luxury ski resort in Aspen for our honeymoon, and everything about it felt perfect at first. The quiet snow, the warm lights, the kind of calm I had never really known growing up. That evening, while my husband was handling our check-in at the front desk, I was standing a few steps away when the resort manager suddenly walked straight toward me. He didn't look like someone welcoming guests. He looked tense, like he had been waiting for me. "Mom, is that man your husband?" he asked quietly. I nodded, a little confused, but he didn't react the way people usually do. He leaned closer, lowering his voice even more. "Then you need to come with me right now." There was no explanation, no polite tone, just urgency. I thought maybe it was a mistake with our reservation, something simple, something fixable. So I followed him. We left the main lobby, turned into a hallway that felt too quiet, and the moment a door closed behind me, something shifted. I'm in shock. Within minutes, I saw something I couldn't explain, something that made it hard to even breathe, and in that moment, I realized this trip wasn't going to be what I thought it was. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me what time it is where you're watching from, and which city you're in. I want to know how far this story reaches. And if you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now let me take you back to how it all started. Minutes later, the warmth of the lobby was gone. The hallway felt too quiet for a place that was supposed to be full of guests. And the further I walked behind the manager, the more I noticed how his pace never slowed, like he had already made up his mind before speaking to me. He stopped in front of a door that didn't look like it belonged to any guest area, opened it without knocking, and motioned for me to step inside. The room was small, controlled, and nothing like the rest of the resort. 2 people were already there, both dressed in dark. Simple clothes that didn't match the relaxed atmosphere outside. They didn't greet me. They watched me, carefully, like they were waiting for a reaction I hadn't given yet. "Mrs. Doyle," one of them said in a calm, even voice, sliding a tablet across the table toward me. "We need you to look at something." I hesitated for a second, then stepped closer. The screen was already on, displaying a profile, not a photo meant for memories, but something official. A name, a date, a set of travel records, and next to it, a picture. I leaned in. The man in the image was my husband. I didn't say anything at first. I just stared, waiting for the explanation that would make it make sense. Instead, the screen changed. Another file appeared, different name, different location, same man. Then another. And another. Each record showed the same pattern: fast engagement, recent marriage registration, followed by a trip. After that, nothing. No follow-up records, no return activity, no financial movement tied to the woman listed. It didn't look like someone leaving for a new life. It looked like someone who had been removed from every system that should have kept track of them. "This has to be wrong," I said quietly, my voice not sounding like my own. The older one across from me shook his head once, not in disagreement, but in certainty. "We've checked every identity linked to these cases. They all connect to the same man." My chest tightened as I looked back at the screen. Each file felt heavier than the last, not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. There were no endings, just blank space where something should have continued. "What are you saying?" I asked, forcing the words out. The second officer leaned forward slightly, his tone careful, measured. "We're saying that every woman connected to him stopped existing on paper shortly after traveling with him. I felt the air shift around me. "He's here," I said, quickly. "He's outside." "This doesn't make any sense." "That's consistent," the first one replied. "Every time." I stared at him, trying to understand what that meant, but he didn't explain further. Instead, he tapped the screen again, bringing up another set of records. Flight bookings, hotel confirmations, identity changes, processed through legal channels that didn't raise immediate flags, all arranged in a way that looked clean, almost too clean. It wasn't chaos, it was structured. I felt my thoughts start to catch up with details I had ignored before, how quickly everything had moved between us, how he handled every booking himself, how little I actually knew about anything that came before me. "So what happens now?" I asked. My voice lower this time. The two of them exchanged a brief look before the older one answered. "Right now, you walk out of this room and act like nothing has changed." The manager remained by the door, silent, watching. "We don't have enough to stop him," the officer continued. "But we have enough to know this isn't random." He slid a small card toward me. I didn't look at it right away. "If anything feels off," he added, "you call that number immediately." For a moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to decide which version of reality I was supposed to believe. Then, I picked up the card and walked toward the door. When I stepped back into the lobby, everything looked exactly the same, except him. He was still standing near the front desk, relaxed, one hand in his pocket, scrolling through his phone like nothing in the world required urgency. And when he saw me, his face shifted into that familiar expression I had trusted so easily. "There you are," he said, his tone light, as if I had only been gone for a moment. "Everything okay?" I forced a small smile and nodded. Just a minor issue with the room. He didn't question it. He didn't seem curious. He simply accepted it. Like details were never something he needed to confirm. His hand rested lightly on my back as we walked toward the elevators, the gesture natural, practiced, and for the first time, I noticed how easily it guided me without feeling like control. Inside the elevator, he glanced at me briefly. "You look tired," he said. "I'm fine," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He studied my face for a second longer than necessary, then looked away. That moment stayed with me, not because of what he said, but because of how carefully he seemed to be reading me, as if he was measuring something I couldn't see. The room was warm when we entered, the kind of comfort that should have made everything feel right again, but it didn't. He moved around with quiet confidence, setting his phone down, adjusting small things, pouring water without asking if I wanted any. Every action smooth, controlled, like a routine. He had followed many times before. We went to dinner later that evening. The restaurant was filled with soft conversation and low lighting, the kind of setting designed for couples who had nothing to hide from each other. He ordered without hesitation, choosing dishes for both of us, explaining it as convenience, something thoughtful, something easy. I agreed without arguing, but I noticed how quickly decisions were made without ever involving me. When I asked about where he grew up, he answered briefly, then redirected the conversation. When I mentioned family, he smiled, but the answer stayed surface level, never moving beyond safe details. Every time the conversation approached something personal, it shifted before it could settle. His phone remained face down on the table the entire time. At one point, I looked up and caught him watching me. Not the way someone looks at a partner, but the way someone observes, attentive, calculating, waiting. The moment our eyes met, he smiled again, soft, familiar, almost enough to make me question everything I had seen earlier. Back in the room, he opened a bottle of wine and handed me a glass. "To us," he said. I raised it slightly, but only took a small sip. He didn't comment, didn't push, just continued, as if everything was unfolding exactly the way he expected. Later, as he sat across from me, his tone casual. "Almost careless," he asked. "Did anyone talk to you while I was parking earlier?" The question felt simple, but it landed differently. "No," I answered. "Just staff." He nodded slowly, his gaze holding mine for a second longer than before. Then he smiled again. Good. That single word didn't feel reassuring. It felt like confirmation of something I didn't understand yet. As the night settled, he moved through the room with the same calm precision, turning off lights, adjusting the curtains, checking his phone briefly before setting it aside again. Everything about him remained consistent, controlled, and almost too perfect, like nothing was left to chance. I lay in bed beside him, staring into the darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. And for the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel like I was lying next to someone I knew. That night, the silence in the room felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced before. The lights were off, the curtains drawn, and the only sound was the faint hum of the heater working against the cold outside. But sleep didn't come, not even close. I lay still beside my husband, my eyes open in the dark, aware of every small movement. Every shift of the mattress, every breath he took. Time moved slowly, stretching into something uncomfortable, something that made it impossible to relax. At some point, I felt him move. It wasn't sudden, it was careful. He shifted his weight slowly, lifting himself from the bed in a way that suggested he didn't want to wake me. And for a second, I kept my eyes closed, pretending I was asleep. Then I heard the soft sound of his footsteps moving across the room. I waited. A door opened quietly. Cold air slipped into the room for a brief moment before the door closed again. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the faint outline of the balcony through the glass, and there he was, standing outside, his back partially turned, one hand holding his phone close to his ear. His voice was low, too low to understand clearly. I focused, straining to catch anything, any word that might explain what was happening, but most of it was lost in the distance, carried away by the wind. Then his tone changed slightly, just enough for one sentence to reach me. "She's exactly where she needs to be." Everything inside me went still. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty, like he was confirming something that had already been decided long before this moment. I didn't move. I didn't react. I kept my breathing steady, my body still, holding on to the silence around me, as if any small sound would give me away. After a while, he ended the call. He remained on the balcony for a few seconds longer, standing there without speaking, without moving much, then finally stepped back inside. The door closed softly behind him. I closed my eyes just before he turned toward the bed. The mattress shifted again as he lay down beside me, his movements just as controlled as before, careful, measured, nothing rushed. I felt him pause. Pause. For a brief moment, it felt like he was looking at me, studying whether I was actually asleep or not. And I resisted the urge to react, to breathe differently, to move even slightly. Then the moment passed. His breathing settled again, steady, even, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The words I had heard replayed in my mind, not because they were loud, but because of how deliberate they sounded. There was no confusion in them, no emotion, just placement, like I was part of something arranged, something positioned exactly where it was meant to be. I stared into the darkness, unable to rest, my thoughts moving faster now, connecting details I hadn't fully understood before. The way he controlled plans, the way he avoided certain topics, the way nothing around him ever seemed unplanned. And now this, horrors passed without sleep. At some point, the darkness outside began to soften slightly, the first hint that morning was approaching, but it didn't bring relief. It only made everything feel more real. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at him again. He looked exactly the same as he had before. Calm, composed, untouched by whatever had just taken place. For anyone else, it would have looked normal. For me, it didn't anymore. The next morning arrived without bringing any sense of clarity. I didn't wait for him to wake up. I got dressed quietly, moving carefully through the room, making sure nothing about my behavior felt out of place, then stepped out into the cold air of the resort. The sizzlance outside, sharper than anything I had felt inside. The card they had given me was still in my hand, the edges slightly bent from how tightly I had been holding it. I followed the directions written on it. The building wasn't part of the main resort. It sat further down, separated from the guests, more functional than luxurious, and when I stepped inside, the warmth felt different, not welcoming, just contained. One of the officers from the night before was already there, waiting. "You came," he said simply. "I need to understand what's happening," I replied. He studied me for a moment, then nodded toward a chair. "There's someone you need to meet first." I didn't ask questions. I just followed him down a narrow hallway, stopping in front of another door. He knocked once, then opened it. Inside, a woman was sitting near the window. She didn't turn immediately. She kept her eyes on the snow outside, as if whatever she was looking at mattered more than who had just entered the room. "This is Ruth Chandler," the officer said. The name didn't mean anything to me at first, but something about the way he said it made me pay attention. Ruth finally looked over. Her expression wasn't fearful. It wasn't relieved either. It was distant, like she had already processed things I hadn't even begun to understand. "You're married to him now," she said. Her voice flat, almost detached. I felt my throat tighten. "You know him?" She let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh, but without any humor. I thought I did. I stepped closer, trying to read her, but it wasn't easy. There was no clear emotion, just a kind of stillness that felt unnatural. "They told me about the others," I said carefully. "They said people just disappear." Ruth shook her head slowly. "That's not what happens," I frowned. "Then, what does?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting briefly toward the officer, then back to me. "You don't disappear," she said. "You get moved." The words settled heavily between us. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means your name changes, your records change. Everything about you gets rewritten in ways that look legal if you don't look too closely," she explained. "At first, it feels like freedom." I felt a flicker of confusion. "Freedom?" She nodded once. That's how it starts. He makes it sound like he's helping you leave things behind, like he's giving you a clean break, and for a while it works. And then? Her expression shifted slightly, not into fear, but into something more controlled, something quieter. Then you realize you don't own anything about your life anymore. The room felt colder, even though the heater was running. "He keeps everything," she continued. "Documents, access, the things that prove who you are. Without them, you can't go anywhere. You can't prove anything. You can't go back to who you were before. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Why would he do that? Ruth didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, then back up. Because once everything depends on him, you don't leave. The simplicity of it made it worse. He never told me that, I said quietly. He wouldn't, she replied. Not at the beginning. I felt something shift inside me, something sharper than fear, something closer to realization. So you're saying he controls them? Ruth held my gaze this time. I'm saying leaving him doesn't mean you're free. The words landed harder than anything I had heard so far. For a moment, no one spoke, then the officer stepped forward slightly. We've been trying to track the pattern for a while, he said. She's the only one who managed to step outside of it, even partially. I looked back at Ruth. How? Her expression didn't change. I stopped trusting him before it was too late. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because, for the first time, I realized I might already be further inside this than I thought. That evening, I stopped, pretending everything was normal. He was in the room when I returned, sitting by the window, watching the snowfall with the same calm expression he always carried, as if nothing around him could ever disrupt the balance he had already decided on. He turned slightly when he heard the door, his eyes settling on me in a way that felt more observant than welcoming. You were out early, he said, his tone even. I needed some air. I replied, closing the door behind me. He nodded once, accepting the answer without pushing further. But the silence that followed didn't feel natural. It felt measured, like he was waiting for something I hadn't said yet. I didn't sit down, I didn't move closer. I stayed where I was and looked directly at him. How many lives have you changed? I asked. The question landed between us, heavy, unavoidable. For the first time since I had known him, he didn't respond immediately. His expression didn't break, but something behind it shifted. Something quieter, something that didn't try to hide anymore. You weren't supposed to ask that, he said finally. I wasn't supposed to know anything, I replied. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxing in a way that felt different from before, less careful, less concerned with maintaining the version of himself I had believed in. And yet, here we are. I took a step forward. Do they know what you're doing? He studied me for a moment. They know enough. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters, he said, his voice steady. The room felt smaller. They think you're helping them, I continued. They think you're giving them a way out. I am, he replied without hesitation. Then, why can't they leave? That was the first moment his expression changed completely. Not anger, not surprise, but something closer to acknowledgement. Because leaving isn't as simple as people think, he said. That's not what I asked. He stood up then, slowly, closing the distance between us without rushing, his presence filling the space in a way that made it harder to breathe. You're asking the wrong question, he said quietly. Then give me the right one. He held my gaze. Ask why they stay. I didn't respond. Because once everything is rebuilt, he continued, once every connection is cut, and every detail is replaced, there's nothing to go back to. No proof, no history, nothing that says who they were before. That's not freedom, I said. It's better than where they started, he replied. And what do you get out of it? That question lingered longer than the others. He didn't answer right away. He walked past me, picking up his phone, setting it down again, as if deciding how much he wanted to say. I make sure nothing falls apart, he said finally. That's not what I meant. He looked at me again, this time without softening anything. Control, he said. The words settled clearly, without hesitation, without apology. You control everything, I repeated. I maintain structure, he corrected. At their expense. At their survival, he replied. The certainty in his voice didn't leave room for doubt. I felt something shift inside me, something that had been holding on to the idea that there might still be another explanation, something less defined, something that could make this easier to understand. There's no difference, I said. There is, he answered. You just don't see it yet. I shook my head slowly. No, I see it now. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped closer, his voice lowering slightly. You're part of this now. The statement didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a fact. You made that decision when you said yes, he added. My chest tightened. I didn't agree to this. You agreed to me, he said. The distinction felt deliberate. I'm not staying, I said. He didn't react immediately. He just looked at me, his expression steady, unchanged. You don't walk away from something like this, he said quietly. I held his gaze. Watch me. By the time morning settled over the mountains, the decision had already been made. I didn't wait for another conversation, another explanation, or another version of the truth that could be shaped into something easier to accept. I packed my things with steady hands, not rushing, not hesitating, moving through the room with a clarity I hadn't felt before. He watched me for a moment, standing near the window, but he didn't try to stop me. You won't get far with what you think you know, he said. I didn't respond. I zipped my bag and walked past him without looking back. The hallway outside felt colder than it had the day before, or maybe I was just more aware of everything now. Every sound, every step, every person who passed by, without knowing what had been unfolding behind closed doors. I didn't go to the lobby. I went straight to the building where I had been told to return if something changed. This time, I didn't hesitate when I walked in. The officers were already there. They didn't ask many questions. They didn't need to. I told them everything I had learned, everything I had seen, everything he had, admitted without realizing how clearly it would sound once spoken out loud. They listened carefully, taking notes, exchanging looks that carried more weight than their words. Nothing about their reaction felt rushed or dramatic. It felt procedural, controlled, like this was only the beginning of something that would take time to fully uncover. He won't walk away from this easily, one of them said. I'm not asking you to stop him immediately, I replied. I'm making sure I'm not part of it anymore. That distinction mattered more than anything else. Later that day, they approached him, not with force, not with noise, but with questions that didn't leave room for easy answers. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but I didn't need to be. The structure he had built around himself wasn't something that collapsed instantly. It required pressure, patience, and proof that went beyond what I alone could provide. What I did know was this: he didn't leave the resort that day the way he had planned to. I left first. The drive away from Aspen felt longer than it should have. The road stretching out in front of me as the snow slowly disappeared behind me, replaced by something more familiar. Something grounded, something real. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. Not to my family who had already decided who I was long ago. Not to the life I thought I needed to build to feel accepted, and not to the man I believed had chosen me for reasons I never questioned deeply enough. I thought about the years I had spent trying to escape being overlooked, trying to become someone worth noticing, someone worth keeping. And in doing that, I had walked straight into something that required me to give up even more than I had before. But this time, I walked out. I didn't call him. I didn't answer the messages that came later. I didn't wait for closure that would never come in a form that made sense. Some things don't resolve cleanly. Weeks later, I heard that the investigation was still ongoing, that more names were being reviewed, that more pieces were being connected slowly, carefully, the way things are handled when they don't fit into simple explanations. I didn't follow it closely. I didn't need to. What mattered was that I was no longer inside it. And that was enough, because the truth is, not every person who offers you a way out is trying to set you free. Some of them are just building a different kind of control. One that looks safer at first, one that feels like protection until you realize it comes with conditions you had never agreed to. I learned that too late to avoid it, but not too late to leave it.